this is the anniversary. Obviously, it's 200 years this Saturday since Engels was born in Barmen in Germany, which was an area which was becoming industrialized. He came from a well-off family, and indeed, as probably a number of you know, his father was a factory owner, and they owned several factories in and around Manchester, in Manchester itself, in Eccles, and various other places. And Engels, I'll talk about a little bit later, spent many years of his life in Manchester, working in the family firm, much of it done in order to support Marx and Marx's family, who were living in London. And when Marx was writing Capital, he was this is what Engels was doing. He was a revolutionary from a very young age. He was somebody who was a tremendous, he was an activist, he was a writer, he was a theoretician. He had amazing talents, Engels. He spoke many, many languages and read many more. He was very, very prolific in learning. He had a great interest in science of various sorts, and a number of the things that he wrote were related to science. When he moved to London later in his life, he was one of the first people in London to have a telephone in his house, which was not only expensive, but also very, very rare. And he died in 1895, so you can imagine how rare it was. And he loved new inventions and anything that was you can imagine what he would like about the technology today, Zoom meetings and so on. So he was a very interesting man in that respect, very, very many talented. He was also an incredibly generous and enthusiastic person about a whole range of things. He was personally very generous, as I said, to Marx, and he was generous in all sorts of ways to Marx's family and everything like that. He was also a great enthusiast for a whole range of issues and campaigns and liberation movements and things like that, which I'll touch on a few of those, but obviously won't have time to deal with most of it. So I just want to talk about 2 or 3 points about Engels, which I think are important in terms of his life and in terms of the ideas that he and Marx collaborated on, because they were great collaborators from the sort of mid-1840s onwards. The famous book that they wrote, the Communist Manifesto, which is generally thought to have been written largely by Marx, the kind of first draft of the Communist Manifesto was a little book called Principles of Communism, which actually Engels wrote. And Engels was actually a much better writer than Marx, in my opinion. It was much easier to read and much less convoluted. He described himself as he was second fiddle to Marx, and he was he regarded Marx as a genius, which I think is absolutely right. And he said, look, I'm just second fiddle to Marx. But I mean, to be honest, to be second fiddle to Marx is probably something that none of us would mind being. So it tells you something about him. What is it that I want to highlight tonight? Firstly, that Engels had a tremendous affection for and understanding of the working class, particularly the working class in England. And in fact, one of the first things that he wrote, and he wrote as a very young man, he wrote a book called The Condition of the Working Class in England, which I would recommend anybody to read. It is a tremendous sort of combination of politics and economics and sociology and polemic against the employing class. He wrote it as a result of, he came to Manchester first in 1842. So he was, 22 when he first came. And he came in the aftermath of the great general strike, which had taken place across Lancashire and Cheshire, parts of Cheshire earlier in 1842. So the whole place was very, very seething with politics and all this kind of thing. And he really understood that from that, he had an abstract notion perhaps before that of what the working class was, but he really understood it in very, very specific and very detailed ways. And he spent, I'll just quote from the preface that he wrote to the first German edition of the Condition of the Working Class. And he says this, I wanted more than a mere abstract knowledge of my subject. I wanted to see you in your own homes, to observe you because this is dedicated to the working classes of Great Britain. I'm afraid it does refer to men, which is how that tended to be in those days. But he also was aware of and in support of many women's causes in his life. He says, I wanted to see you in your own homes, to observe you in your everyday life, to chat with you on your condition and grievances, to witness your struggles against the social and political power of your oppressors. I have done so. I forsook the company and the dinner parties, the port wine and champagne of the middle classes, and devoted my leisure hours almost exclusively to the intercourse with plain working men. I'm both glad and proud of having done so. And he writes later on in this thing, because obviously his English was very good, but it wasn't perfect English. He was a German speaker by origin, and he said, I may be a foreigner to them, meaning the ruling class, but not to you, I hope. Though my English may not be pure, yet I hope you will find it plain English. So he's already making a kind of pun about that. No working man in England, nor in France either, by the by, has ever treated me as a foreigner. With the greatest pleasure, I observe you to be free from that blasting curse, national prejudice and national pride, which after all means nothing but wholesale selfishness. And, you know, he goes on like this. So he's got this, you can see from that his huge kind of devotion and enthusiasm to the working class. And that influenced Marx. I mean, Marx was, you know, Marx at various points was exiled at this time in Brussels, in Paris. And he didn't have the same knowledge or contact with the working class. So this was a huge thing that Engels brought to the partnership, if you like, and he had a very clear understanding of it. He was friendly with a whole number of people, including George Julian Harney, who was one of the leading Chartists of the time. He was a great fan of the Chartists for very good reasons. He knew Robert Owen, the socialist philanthropist. He knew all of these people, and he mixed with them. So that is the first thing, I think. And his idea of the working class, and as they described it, as the gravedigger of capitalism, as a class which had the power to overthrow capitalism, was central to his whole life. The second thing I want to say just very briefly is about his ideas about revolution. Marx and Engels themselves were both active revolutionaries. In 1848, revolution spread across Europe, and they both returned to Germany, to Cologne, in what was then, I mean, Germany was dozens and dozens of little states in 1848, sort of principalities and dukedoms and all that kind of thing. And they returned to the Rhineland and to Cologne, where they led they called themselves the extreme left of the democracy movement, because of course this was a series of revolutions which essentially were about getting rid of the old feudal order and establishing capitalist relations, capitalist social relations, which Marx and Engels believed would very quickly lead on, once you had capitalism, you would then very quickly lead on to socialism. And they were treated as they were, as dangerous revolutionaries. They were threatened with all sorts of things. Engels was actually involved in fighting in a war in South Germany, in Baden, in 1849, the Revolutionary War there, which was defeated. And he then eventually made his way via, I think, the vineyards of France, of eastern France, to England. And he and Marx were both exiled from Germany, and he didn't go back for many years. And they settled initially in London, and then, as I say, in Manchester. But for them, revolution was always present, even though those revolutions were defeated, and that led to all sorts of problems for the working class movement, for the socialist movement in Britain and elsewhere. He always looked for the kind of the possibilities of revolution. And for many years after 1848, he saw it in national struggles, national liberation struggles in Poland and in Ireland, the fight of the United States. He was a huge fan of the northern cause in the United States in the Civil War, obviously against slavery, and in fact he and Marx write lots of the things that are put down as having been written by Marx were actually written by Engels on this question about the American Civil War, because he was a great expert on military tactics, and in fact was called the nickname the General by Marx's family. And he was constantly, you know, why are the North being so useless? Why can't they win the battles? The South are a sort of, you know, they should be an extinct kind of social force, but they're winning the battles. And they followed the American Civil War incredibly closely and with, as I say, with great enthusiasm. Some of the people who fought with them in 1848 actually fought in that war on the side of the North. So they knew people who were involved in that. So his whole idea of revolution, even when there wasn't a socialist revolution on the agenda, was incredibly important to him. So that was the second point, I suppose. The third thing was about his ideas, which we call today historical materialism, the idea that all history is a history of class struggles, that it's in the process of struggle that you begin to change history, and that history is not made by great men and women, it's made by the struggles between these classes, as it was in the English Revolution in the 17th century, the French Revolution in the 18th century, and as he believed and hoped it would be in Germany in the 19th century. Now, the reason that Marx and Engels concluded why the revolutions lost in Germany was that they concluded that the bourgeoisie, the new emerging capitalist class and its allies, was more frightened of the working class, which was now a real force, not just in Britain, but was beginning to be, and in France, but beginning to be so in Germany as well. And they use the expression, they say to the bourgeoisie, they say, all right, you know, you've made your peace with the old order, but the executioner is waiting at the door, is the way they put it, the executioner being the working class, and they're going to do for you. And of course, as one of the commentators on Marx and Engels said, Hal Draper, an American socialist, said, and of course the bourgeoisie, when they saw the executioner waiting at the door, they shut the door, and therefore they would rather not have a fully fledged revolution, which would bring them the kind of society that they wanted, if in turn that would create the working class. So he had a very dialectical understanding of all of this, and it was very important to him. And it's very often, there's lots of people kind of have the view that Marx was the great theoretician and Engels was just a sort of mechanical, you know, popularizer of Marx's ideas. And I think this is a real travesty of his writing, that his writing was extremely impressive, both in terms of style, but more importantly, in terms of content. And his little book, you know, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, is a very, very good, one of the best explanations of what socialism really is. So I would recommend people reading that. Just finally on Engels, the final point I'd like to make was, of course, he did believe, as did Marx, that socialists had to have an organization. Now, as we all know, at different periods, you can have mass organizations or you can have very, very small organizations. For many of their much of their life, particularly this period in exile, there was no prospect of revolution of the sort of building a mass revolutionary organization. But they always tried to build an organization, and they had, you know, they had the Communist League when they were young. They were involved in what was called the First International in the 1860s, which was an attempt at international coordination for not just socialist ideas, trade union ideas as well. Engels, after Marx's death, was instrumental in setting up what was called the Second or the Socialist International in 1889, where you had socialist parties really growing around Europe. And he was particularly involved in the formation of the Independent Labour Party in this country very near the end of his life, as was Eleanor Marx, Marx's youngest daughter, and her husband, Edward Aveling, because he saw the prospects of, there'd been huge strikes in the 1880s, which again, Engels was very, very supportive of and enthusiastic of, although he was quite an old old man by then, but very, very keen on them. And he saw the possibility of socialist organisation, and he thought it would come through Labour. Now we know what happened in terms of what happened to the ILP and what happened to Labour, but he believed there had to be working class organisation. The working class had to be able to organise itself independently of other classes and so on. So those are the main things I think we can kind of take from Engels today. I think that his legacy is a tremendous legacy. It was a great sacrifice for him to live in not to live in Manchester. I'm sorry, that's very rude. To live and work in Manchester at Erman and Engels, but he did it in order to keep the Marx family. I mean, the Marx family were, living in London at the time, and Marx had 3 young daughters, and Engels would get these letters saying, "Oh, it's dreadful that everyone, we owe the butcher money, we owe the coal merchant money, we owe all these people money, and it's Christmas. Can you send some champagne?" And even though Engels, in that little preface to the working classes of Great Britain, says that he forsook champagne, that isn't quite true. He did like champagne, and he liked drinking, and he liked enjoying himself. So Engels would send them, crates of champagne and all this sort of thing. And he was able to do this because he worked at Erman and Engels, and he really didn't like working there. And there's the description of him when he leaves, if I can find it. I'm not sure I can find it because I didn't put a mark in there. Oh yes, I can find it. Eleanor Marx, Marx's youngest daughter, was in Manchester staying with Engels and his partner Lizzie Burns, who he didn't marry. He had a relationship firstly with a woman called Mary Burns, Irish, working class Irish woman, and then she died suddenly when she was quite young, and then he had a relationship with her sister Lizzie, which lasted until Lizzie died many years later, and Engels married Lizzie on her deathbed because he said, she'd be worried that she wanted to be sort of respectable in this sort of sense. So he had quite a sort of bohemian attitude, I suppose, for people in that time. And they certainly had a kind of eccentric sort of household. She describes the day he stops working for Erman and Engels. And she said it was that summer day, 21 years later. Engels writes, Eleanor writes, "I was with Engels when he reached the end of this forced labour, and I saw what he must have gone through all those years. I shall never forget the triumph with which he exclaimed, for the last time, as he put his boots on in the morning to go to the office. A few hours later, we were standing at the gate waiting for him. We saw him coming over the little field opposite the house where he lived. He was swinging his stick in the air and singing, his face beaming. Then we set the table for a celebration and drank champagne." So this, this was something that he did. He did sacrifice himself for. His last years of his life, obviously, Marx died quite a long time before Engels, and that was a huge loss to him. He lived for another 12 years after Marx died. It's interesting when you look at what Engels wrote. It's largely before. I mean, this is a gross exaggeration, but in terms of big books that he wrote, it's largely before he had to go and work at Erman and Engels, and then it is afterwards, from 1870 onwards, where he wrote quite prolifically on a range of subjects, including a very important book on women's oppression and the family. So this was his contribution was to help Marx, and he made a huge contribution himself. So I think he was a giant of the socialist movement, and as we know, if you stand on the shoulders of giants, you can see a long way. And I think that's one of the things we should all use this bicentenary to actually read Engels and to discuss it and look at the ideas that he stood for. So thanks very much.